True Story is a documentary podcast powered by the Institute of Documentary Film. You can find news from the world of film on all the common platforms such as iTunes, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, as well as on docweb.net.
Good evening or good morning to everyone who is watching us today. I would like to welcome you to a very special IDF Industry Session organized by the Institute of Documentary Film in Prague. Today it's going to be all about the impact of documentary films. And I'm very happy that Lina Srivastava agreed to give a lecture called How Documentaries Can Catalyze Systematic Change. Lina is our special guest who will share with you her experience with documentary films and strategies that can help to create social change. She will be accompanied by another great woman and film professional, Margje de Koning, artistic director of Movies That Matter Festival, who will be a moderator and will have a conversation with Lina. This lecture is organized with kind support of the US Embassy in the Czech Republic and American Film Showcase. So thank you very much to both. And before I turn the imaginary mic to Lina and Margje, I would like to encourage all of you who watch us to ask questions. Use the chat on Facebook and we will try to answer to as many questions as possible. So enjoy the lecture. And now I give floor to Lina and Margje.
Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm very honored to be here. And it's very important to talk about how film can be a starting point of impact in different ways. So Lina and me, when we had the prep talk, we talked about what are the different cultures, how do we all perceive impact, what kind of impacts do we have, and how could it be used? And when you look up Lina, and I very much encourage you to do so, you can see that she created narrative-based social change initiatives with NGOs, global institutions, independent media creators, combining the field experience and direct service with skills in media, audience engagement, expertise, and so on and so on and on. She's the founder of Center of Transformational Change, a global platform of SEAL, the Creative Impact Experience Lab. And on that note, Lina, I could go on and on and on with who you have been working, organizations like UNICEF, UNESCO, the World Bank, International Rescue Community, Film Aid, and so much more. Welcome, Lina. It's an honor to be here with you today and to talk about what can impact do and how we will together explore how is it you're based in New York, how is it in the United States, I'm based in Amsterdam, how is it in my part of the world, and of course, for the people listening, what can we offer you? What is going on in Southeast Europe on that note? And I know that you had some things to say and do a little keynote and introduction to the subject. So without further ado, I'm very happy to listen to you, and I'm pretty sure everybody else as well. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Margje. It's such a pleasure to be with everybody. I wish I were there with you in the real world. I love Prague. I love visiting all of you. Someday soon, we'll be in the same space together, I hope. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit. The way we're going to do this is I'll talk for just a little while, and then we're going to have a conversation, Margje and I, and we'll open it up to you as well. So Margje gave you my brief bio, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about why this topic is important to me. Why social impact strategy for documentaries is important to me, and why I believe that film has a role to play in the way we create systems change, the way we create social change, the way we create progress moving forward. So I'm a former attorney. I was a lawyer for a few years, and I was incredibly bored, and it was very soul drying. And I was trying to find what I wanted to do to contribute better to the world, and I just kept coming back to human rights and the international development sector. And I became the executive director of an organization called Kids with Cameras at one point, about 2003. And that was attached to the film Born into Brothels, which ended up winning the Academy Award in 2005. And that movie is about young children in a red light district in Kolkata now, who use the power of photography and art and self-expression to understand their place in the world. And the film is it's a beautiful sort of visual document. And as the executive director of the nonprofit, I was able to use the film to start community engagement work with the children, with the people in the communities, and sort of worldwide. And all of a sudden, something sort of like locked into place for me. I started realizing that image, visual, storytelling, and film, like that whole range of things, had a much deeper role, had a much deeper place in the way we think about advocacy and the way we think about doing impact work. Because before then, it was very much about dialogue, which is very important. It was about data, numbers. It was about sort of more traditional structures that I had been sort of playing with. But all of a sudden, it clicked for me that there is a role for film, there's a role for image, and there's a role for storytelling, particularly from the communities who are most affected. There's a role for that. And so I started my company, my last company, after I sort of left being an executive director of nonprofits. I started a company, a social enterprise called CL, called the Creative Impact and Experience Lab. And through that, we did a range of work. It was always based in strategy, based in social impact strategy, and a sort of a significant amount of work was in film, was in documentary. So the reason that I went towards the impact strategy side and not the film production side, right? I decided I wasn't going to become a film producer, is because I come from advocacy. I come from human rights. I come from these sort of structures and frameworks and strategies that I thought would be really important to bring to the film community as well, to bring to the documentary community. And so I ended up becoming involved with this community of amazing impact strategists and producers, led first by Jennifer MacArthur and Brenda Coughlin and people like this who are now in different parts of the industry, and also by what was then BritDoc and now Doc Society. And it became clear, this was around 2008, it became clear in sort of the United States and Canada and the UK, sort of that sort of group of documentarians and filmmakers and philanthropists, that there was an interesting methodology here, right? That the ability to bring impact strategy and impact production to a film was going to be very important in social change work, in social justice work, and also in cultural change work, right? So there are different kinds of ways to use this. And it became really important to say that film, as much as film is cultural expression, it's also catalytic. It also provokes opinion, it provokes dialogue, it provokes action, right? So if you have a film, you can just watch the film. It can be a beautiful document. It can be a beautiful piece of artwork, and it should be. But it can also be something that becomes a force or just a provocation, right, towards a more positive change. And so this is why this started happening sort of before 2010. And I started working on a couple of different documentaries, which I'm going to tell you about right now. The first one is it's a film called Is Danny Cristal, which was opening night film at Sundance in 2013. I started working with the team and on the issue in about 2009. And we did the social impact strategy starting then in 2009. The film debuted in 2013. And we did the work until about 2017 or 18. So it was a 9-year arc for this project. It's a standalone film that is about one man who was found dead on the US side of the US-Mexico border. His name was Dilcy Johan. He was from Honduras. And that his body was discovered, and he, in a fairly rare case, he was able to be identified partly by a tattoo on his chest that said Danny Cristal, and that's where the name of the movie comes from, because the clue to his identity. And off of this narrative, right? So the film documents his discovery. It documents where he left and why, the home, the community, the town that he left in Honduras, the journey he probably took from Honduras into Mexico, into the United States, and then what happened in the United States, like how was he identified and how was he repatriated? And so off of that, we have an entire impact report that I will put into the chat that documents how we decided to build the strategy around this. What we did, how we came about, how we came up with the strategy, how much it cost, what the outcomes were for the community and for audiences. But basically what we did is we took the sort of the 3-part narrative of this film and built a system of issues around it. We didn't build the issues, sorry, we derived the issues from that. And then we built a digital presence in a website where you can still go, it's still active. You can look at the way we've constructed this sort of like idea of the system of migration that's happening from Central America up to the United States. There used to be ways to take action, direct action. We also worked with a coalition of nonprofits and NGOs along the border in the United States, in Mexico, and in Central America. And they're the ones who advised us on what the issues were that we needed to concentrate on. Because everything, we'll talk about this a little bit later, everything must be community-led, right? So I am not imposing my structure on this. Even though I'm a human rights advocate, even though I have a certain amount of expertise in these issues, what I do must be informed by and led by the community. And sometimes that's the NGOs, and sometimes that's the affected community themselves. And so we did this, and then we did direct action. We did a lot of training. So we did this comprehensive sort of strategy and almost ran it like a mini nonprofit, right? Like there was a structure around it. And then we documented the outcomes. That film, I think, again, that was a 9-year arc. It was fairly catalytic. It moved me forward as well in thinking about how strategy can be applied using a film, and then using a number of different assets around it. So we built a website, as I said. We financed a mural in Arizona. We helped an organization create itself, under the banner of the Impact campaign. We worked directly with the community and helped them fundraise for their water access systems, their schools, and things like that. So it was this sort of like very multi-pronged, multi-platform, multi-stakeholder thing. So that's case study number 1, and we'll talk a bit about that more. You can ask me a question about that. The second case study is coming from the nonprofit side. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been working off and on with a filmmaker and activist named Josh Fox, who is, he did Gasland, which was nominated for an Oscar in 2010 now, and subsequently has done 5 more films around anti-fracking or climate change, or sort of like the culture and the storytelling around climate change and politics. And so he's done anywhere from film to short film to journalistic pieces. He also does direct action and direct service with communities. He does music, and he does a podcast and does live shows. And so that's coming from almost from like a different side. Like it's a body of work. So with Is Danny Cristal, we created a body of work around one film. And it was a true transmedia kind of thing because there was one core story. With Josh, there's a series of assets that he builds and a series of communities that he engages with. And it's anywhere from working with communities to think about renewable energy and transferring, sort of away from fracking. He's one of the architects of the international anti-fracking movement, to doing, sort of like conversations with other human rights activists, with political activists, with cultural movers. And the impact strategy there is he drives it. So I'm, sort of like I'm a thought partner with him often. But he's driving direct contact with communities every single time. And his impact is like well documented as well. So film, nonprofit, he runs a nonprofit, it's about 23 years old now. So there are different ways to sort of approach impact strategy using culture and film. You can do it with a documentary. You can do it with an organization that uses documentary. The third one I'll talk about is a project that didn't use documentary at all, but it brought in people who've been using documentary and social impact strategy and applied that structure of community engagement, of nonprofit consultation, of sort of understanding the narrative and the way the narrative needs to shift. This was done for a project that didn't use documentary at all. It's called In Plain Sight. And this was last year. And it was about the rising number of immigrant detentions in private detention facilities in the United States. And we, primarily for migrants and immigrants from Central America, but people coming through there as well. And people coming in from Haiti and people coming in from the Middle East. And the number of people who are detained right now is astronomical. And so In Plain Sight is a project. It's a sort of a performance art project. It's a public art project, and it's a direct service project. And what the artist did, this was done by two artists, one who's a visual and performance artist, a trans artist named Castles, and then a visual artist named Rafa Esparza, who came together to bring a coalition of 80 artists who are often activists as well, poets, visual artists and such, to write 80 messages that were then sky typed using planes in and around different detention centers in the country. And there's a documentary that's being made about it, right? So the documentary is going to come second. And the impact strategy, so we created an impact strategy, and then we worked with an amazing impact producer to do coalition work and coalition strengthening work into existing coalitions. Like, the work that we do is not, we don't build coalitions. We support existing ones. We support existing movements. Is to make sure that anywhere there was sort of a sky type message, or there was some kind of like artistic intervention, that there was a direct service on the ground. There was direct service or some kind of like action on the ground, so that it wasn't just a spectacle, so that it wasn't just, something that would literally disappear afterwards. We wanted lasting impact, lasting effects, so that the theory, of course, and the philosophy being that anything that we do as storytellers, anything that we do as cultural creators, has to then also contribute positively to the affected community, positively and long lasting, so that we're not extractive, right? So that we're not making our art based on their story and we're not exploiting them. So this was a standalone artistic, intervention that will then create a documentary later. And the documentary will be about the project, but it'll also be about the issues. And that will be coming from PJ Raval, who I worked with a few years ago on Call Her Ganda, which we'll talk about in the webinar tomorrow. So those are sort of like three different kinds of ways that you can use documentary film to catalyze change. And two of them are about immigration. One of them is about sort of climate change and fracking. Everything works together. Everything's everything's engaged in a system, right? But I wanted to sort of talk about these three because they're three very different ways of applying social impact strategy and creating change. They're all obviously of different lengths. Like one project was 9 years long. The second one is an ongoing relationship because we need to transform things over time. The third one was like a 9-month project. In plain sight, even with that was done, my engagement there was 9 months. So not every project has to be decades long. There can be short, and you can create very lasting impact even with a short kind of intervention. The finances around this, like I know, we often talk about how these things are financed.
Yeah, would be my question.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this more. We can have a deeper conversation about this. But in the United States, in Canada, and in the UK, there are structures, right, to support this kind of work. We're still not far enough along, and we talk a little bit more. Often the way some of these projects are financed is through a marketing budget, and marketing and impact strategy are completely different. They're very, very different. Often they're lumped together because it is about engaging communities. The difference is that with marketing, you want everyone possible to see your content or see your media, right? And especially as an artist, especially as a filmmaker, you want everyone to be able to see it, and you want to be able to use your work to build up a portfolio often, right? With impact, I don't care how many people see it. I care that the right people see it. So it's very different. It's about audience, about targeting audience in a very different way. It's about pushing them towards action. It's about leading them to a different view, a different perspective. It's not about raising awareness, because raising awareness doesn't do a thing in the world. That's like your first step. It's about pushing them along a strategy. So like going from awareness to engagement to action to change. Like I have an equation that I actually think about. And the way we often finance these things is in sort of the marketing way, and that makes it a little bit messy. Having said that, there are structures. There are definitely structures to support impact strategy. We're a little more advanced, I think, than some of the other regions or countries in being able to access philanthropic dollars or issue-based dollars. Like there are issue funders. So for example, with Is Danny Cristal, the way we financed it, the impact strategy primarily was all through funders who are concerned with migration and migrant rights, right? With the way International WOW is financed is through a system of different grants that in terms of like climate change and media and art and theater. Same with IPS. There was more sort of like cultural funding. There was some Canadian funding because Castle's Canadian. Those kinds of things. So it's a mixed bag, but there are possibilities, right, about how you do this. It can be it can be its own full-time job trying to finance these things, but there are structures, right? And I think it's really important as we start looking at where we are as a globe, where we are as a world, when we're thinking about climate change, when we're thinking about mass displacement, when we're thinking about gender rights, when we're thinking about massive inequality and the rise of sort of like the erosion of democratic rights and civic participation and the rise of authoritarianism. There are all these different sort of issues that are starting to intersect that need transformation. There is a role for film and storytelling to play, particularly from expert storytellers, right? Because you're not going to engage. So, often people will try to do advocacy films, and those actually don't work as well as artistic or human films, right? So with like Is Danny Cristal, the film is, definitely has information, it has testimony, it has all those things, but it is artistically constructed. Gasland is entertaining. It's like you need the human. You need to be engaged. You need storytellers to be able to frame an issue. The last documentary that I watched was Writing with Fire. I watched it at Sundance in January, but I then rewatched it on Monday. And it's a film that's coming out theatrically. It came out this week in the United States. It will go hopefully everywhere internationally, maybe not India, but it's an Indian documentary. It's absolutely brilliant. And it is catalytic in the way people think about the role of cultural expression in India at a time when patriarchy is on the rise. So the film is about this one media outlet that's run by Dalit women, and Dalits are, it's the term for people who are excluded from the caste system. And it's Dalit women who are absolutely fierce, and they run their own sort of journalism outlets at a time when no other journalism outlet in India is run by women, exclusive women. And it is so fierce, and it's so it's such a beautiful example of how a film can be both artistic, human, narrative, and advocacy, right? So you want to make sure that you have all of those things together, because for me as a strategist, as someone who's an advocate, I can use a human film or an artistic film better than I can use one that's purely advocacy. And that's why it's really important for professional storytellers and people who know how to document and people who know how to draw the human story and the beauty out of something. It's really important. And so film has a role in systems transformation. I'm going to stop there so you and I can have a conversation now.
Well, it's mind-blowing, inspiring what you're saying, and I can pick up on quite a lot of things, but if I can pick up on the last thing you were saying, which I find it's very interesting to hear, that you as a strategist and what you're doing for impact, and that's different from marketing a film, that if I would do a straight on advocacy, an activist film, that would not, how you say, resonate so well as a film like, who I know obviously really well, Writing with Fire, and there are more films like Writing with Fire who give me room to think. They're also very funny, by the way. There's a lot in that film which helps me to understand the Indian society, but also apart from that, generates impact. But I think the film itself generates impact. But if you talk about the strategy of films that like a film like that, how you then, I think it would be interesting to hear, like, if we go back to your first example of that film, which in the end becomes a 9-year journey. How do you define where you want the impact to be generated? So the first thing is, as you will see, is awareness. Awareness is, let's get the film out and let it be seen by as many people as possible. Something like that. But impact, the way you describe it, is also something else. It's getting it to the right people. How do you? Could you talk us through a little bit how you then find these right groups where the film need to go to, and then alongside, as you said very clearly and profoundly so, there's a financial thing to that as well, because it can be a full-time job. So how do you combine these two?
Yeah. So one, it is a full-time job. I think, anybody who, any particular film won't be a full-time job, but impact strategy and impact production, that's its own role, and it is a full-time job. For me, I am a human rights advocate by profession. I look at systems change and transformational change. Like, that's the lens that I take on everything. Yeah. And that's why my company now is called Center for Transformational Change, because it's about, like, what are we building towards?
Yeah.
So I'm less an advocate now and more of a builder. But I have certain subject matter expertise. So I know migration and refugee rights very, very well. Yeah. And I keep up with that. And I'm in sort of conversations around that. And I do desk research and primary research on those issues. Same thing with climate justice. So maybe not like, I'm not an expert on sort of climate change in terms of like renewable energy, but in terms of the justice aspects, I know that, right? And I'm fluent with that. Same thing with like gender rights. So the way I come to this is that I'm always sort of keeping up with what issues are, where they're going, what people are talking about, what the evolutions and the innovations within that. But then I always defer to the people who are sort of quote unquote on the ground, right? So either the most affected communities, the people who are bearing the brunt of the issue. So there's a lot of community engagement, there's dialogue, but then also the sort of the system of NGOs who are working on those issues and who's sort of coming up, who's long established, because they will not only tell you what you need to be working on in terms of your strategy, but they will tell you how it's best that they will use your content. Yeah. Often NGOs, even big ones, but like definitely little ones, they don't have a media budget. They don't have a professional storyteller on call, right? And so what they will put out often disappears because they'll put out a white paper or sort of a presentation or a PDF, which are essential, right? I'm not saying that, I'm not denigrating that work. I think it's absolutely crucial, but they don't have the power or the funding or the ability to turn that into something that is more engaging or that is simpler, right? Or that is going to be interesting to the layperson, right? To read, right? Like how many people in the world really did read, the IPCC report? I think everybody in the planet should read it, right? But and they had, they're not a great example because they have quite a lot of, sort of ability to sort of do the engagement around that. But like smaller nonprofits don't.
Yeah.
And so often what the relationship with the strategist and a filmmaker and the NGO, the way I like to say it is like, what do you need from us? What do you need in terms of story? They should not be affecting the story. They should not be advising on the story. The narrative.
You have to have your journalistic independence, right?
Absolutely. So on the story that, and I don't, that's why I'm not a film producer. I don't comment on the story because I need it to remain pure, right? I need the story to go where it's going to go, even if it's inconvenient, right? Even if your protagonist in your documentary isn't fantastic, right? Whatever.
Doing what you would like to do, but still, on the other hand, you have to start very often alongside when you start the production, you have to start thinking about the impact as well, isn't it? I mean,
at the beginning, yeah. At the beginning.
These are two tracks.
They're two tracks. And often, impact is tacked on at the end. It's like, okay, we did this film. Now we want it to have an impact. Often, sometimes that might be too late, right? Yeah, so you want to preserve, sort of purity, right? Between the process of constructing the narrative and the process of creating the impact strategy. They have to work together at the same time, but no one should be changing what the story is. And so the NGO should not be telling you what the story is.
Does it happen sometimes?
It does happen sometimes. It shouldn't, but it does.
Yeah.
So I'll be honest. But yeah, what they should be saying is like, this is how I can use it best for my movement work, or this is how I can use it to engage my stakeholders or my funders or, whoever. So, so we can create the products of the impact campaign to best serve them.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to duplicate efforts. You don't want to extract from a movement and then just do your own thing. You want to be in partnership. You want to be in coalition with the people who are doing the work, right? Because otherwise, it's useless, to a certain extent. If you're running off doing your own thing.
Yeah. And how, if I look, I mean, I know the United States is slightly, and I think with Canada and the UK are slightly ahead of us with what you're doing, which Doc Society is doing with a good pitch and so on. And I think in a country like NES, we really, people want to be with things, but I always have the feeling, being a little bit maybe unkind, that NGOs and funds sometimes have to be educated a little bit about how you could use film. Do you encounter that as well, or is that now behind you? Have you flattened that path out? Do people now understand, or is it still every time you have to explain why film can be a fantastic tool for impact?
I think we're further along than we were like a decade ago, probably. I think there's less explanation that has to be done on why film in general is a good thing. I think there's sometimes hesitation because it's not, we are further ahead than, like I said, other people, other regions in terms of funding, but it's a very expensive proposition, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the sort of the return on investment has to be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and so I think what has to be I think a few things still have to be communicated, for this work to be done better. One is, how can film, how can it be integrated all the time, right? As a not a special tool, but a daily tool, right? How can video, how can film, how can image be done better? How can it be done more ethically, right? So it's not like we're not creating poverty porn all the time. How it can be used in cultural engagement. So, not every film is going to be a human rights film. Not every film is going to be sort of a climate change film. Some of them are going to be about culture. Like one of my favorite documentaries this year is Summer of Soul, which is not a human rights documentary, but it is about culture. And it's very much, it's very much about conversations we're having in the United States and elsewhere around, cultural, the cultural contributions, from that time period that resonate forward. So I think we have to sort of understand a little bit better in the NGO community and also in the film and the strategy community, like how film can be used as a much more prominent tool, as a much more, but also a much more common tool. So that's number one. I think number two is that we need to understand how to finance things better so that things aren't in the marketing line. And, I think what's interesting about, some people in the audience are from sort of Central Europe and Eastern Europe and such. And I think there's a chance, because the industries are a little bit further behind us, they can learn from our mistakes, right? And create new structures, which I think is.
What was your biggest mistake then, for them to learn? What was something like you would never do again now?
I think some of the biggest industry mistakes is I spent a lot of time, especially like when I was working as an executive director around Born to Brothel, like a lot of my time was spent just fighting with the distributor, right? Because often I think it's much better now, but I think, distribution and marketing and impact and like the goals of impact can often be opposed to one another. Because like I said, what distributors want to do is they want to get awards, they want to get seats into theaters. Sorry, they want people in seats in theaters, they want to sell. And again, like as an impact strategist, someone who's interested in how the film can be catalytic for systems change, or how it can like sort of move a neighborhood or a society, a community or a society or whatever forward. Again, I'm not interested in marketing numbers. I'm not interested in the numbers of people who are seeing it. I'm interested in who needs to see it. And so I need to create assets around that.
So you have a different goal, and those two could fight, because if we and then absolutely, there's coming a question in a minute, and I'm going to that. Because your two goals for the same film can be different, because when you do impact, you take a political journalistic stand. Mm-hmm. Always you do. And that maybe, I don't know, it's just an open question, and that could also be a friction, isn't it?
There is a friction there. And I think, that's something I'd like to see flattened out. So that's something that I think is a lesson that needs to be learned. Yeah. Also that I think that there is an interest there. I think it's less so now, but there's been an interesting tension, as you said, between the political and the journalistic. Yeah. Is that, some people have argued very strongly that documentarists and, filmmakers should not take an advocacy position. They should just be telling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And, for me as an advocate, and for me as someone who comes out of the sort of the more sort of NGO or the advocacy community, I'm like, don't go into a community and extract their story and just tell it and then leave them behind. Like, right? So I'm an advocate. And so the political and the journalistic sometimes is also in.
Yeah. And there's actually it's quite nice because there's a question here from somebody from the audience. It says, can you tell us more about how you cooperate with the different communities? That's actually what we just talked about. How do you engage them in the documentary project? Because and that's actually what you're just saying now. I mean, to give back to the community something. I mean, I can tell about how we do the Movies That Matter, but I'm just really interested how you do that. If you the three actually all examples you have, you could take back to communities or not, or how do you then involve and engage them? Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely, and then I'd love to hear how you do it at Movies That Matter. Because so the structure is, and there's actually a talk that I give that is specifically about this, like how do you cultivate community power through storytelling?
Exactly.
And so the method is, on the one hand, as an independent, sort of, I run a social enterprise, right? I run a center, and I am usually in relationship to the NGO community, right? And so the NGO community sometimes can be in relationship to the communities. Sometimes they're at odds with it. Sometimes communities who are most affected by an issue, such as migration, such as sort of seeking asylum, or climate disaster and such, they don't necessarily always trust the communities. Trust the NGOs, because the NGOs, they see them as
of course, right? Yeah.
There are a number of different ways to either engage with the community directly, or to go through the NGOs that are trusted, right? And so, for example,
but you have to do good research. You have to know who you can trust and who you can't trust. I mean, you as the impact producer, isn't it?
But it's not just about research. It's about being in relationship with people already. So, I as a person who works in sort of migration and refugee and climate and such, I have a series of relationships already that change and evolve and such. But if I'm going to say, for example, with IPS, with In Plain Sight that was done last year, so there was a team of us who were working on the impact strategy and impact production side. Now, I would have worked on the strategy. The difference is strategy is like I'm mapping out what needs to happen. I'm creating the goals, the vision, the methodologies, the framework. And then there's the impact producer who's implementing and getting it done and creating and maintaining those relationships, right? So I have some relationships, but the impact strategist, in our case, it was Set Hernandez Rugincio, who's like amazing, had a series of relationships as well with nonprofits on the border and in the interior of the United States who are working on immigration rights and such, but also with, they put, us, the team, into contact with some people who are either previously detained or not. But there was a very, very strong need to protect privacy and security, and also, again, not be extractive. What you don't want to do is go into a group of people, like a community that's been traumatized.
Yeah, exactly. And vulnerable. Yeah.
Right. And they're vulnerable, and then say, well, I want to tell your story.
Maybe not.
Yeah. You don't want to quite, there are layers of relationship building, layers of, the way you sort of create an interview rubric, or the way you sort of ask and listen to people who want to contribute, who know that there is, that their story will be catalytic to a certain extent, but you can't force that, right? Okay. So this is all about being in relationship with people directly who are affected, or with groups of organizations that are in relationship to them, right? Yeah. So you need to, it's about research, it's about community, cultivating that community. So as a filmmaker, you want to align yourself with an impact strategist who has relationships in those communities.
And knows the subject really well, because if I hear you talking, it's also by really divining where, on which moment, and how you use, in the nice sense of the word, the film to create a certain impact. But you have to divine that all the way through, because if you do it, as you said, for a traumatized group and show that film in a just slightly different way, it loses its impact totally and completely.
Yeah, and you will lose the trust of the community. Like there was a film that was made. I wasn't involved with it, thank God. But there was a film that was made back in like 2010, 2011. And it was a woman, a Western journalist documentarian, had gone to India to embed with a community of Deodasis, who are people who serve a temple community, and some of them are sex workers and such. And the documentary embedded with them, told, quote unquote, to tell their story. And then when they saw what she had produced, it was completely inaccurate. It was paternalistic. So she ended up putting some of them at danger because of the way she framed their roles. Yeah. And what they did is they did a response documentary.
Wow, that's cool.
And her film was called Prostitutes of God or something. It was really deeply paternalistic. But they did this whole response documentary, like, this is what you, Western documentarian, did to us. And it was so powerful. We created this whole community called Regarding Humanity, sort of based on that incident, about the ethics of storytelling with communities.
That's another one, but that's another one. And in a minute, I have another question for you. There's a question.
Yeah, cool. So, I think, so there are, just to summarize that question,
sure.
There are, sort of structures of how you develop relationships that always have to evolve, and you always have to sort of check in with the community. Because what you don't want to do is extract from them, and you don't want to sort of lose their trust, because
that's counterproductive on all sides, and for number one for them, right? Yeah,
exactly. But it's about relationship. It's about listening. It's about establishing, sort of trust structures, and then it's about plain old ethical listening, active listening, and then sort of storytelling. And that filmmakers know how to do anyway. So that's when you get to that process.
Yeah, and that's listening and everything and then still you're the ones, but we talk about maybe after this question, because it's a really nice question, how you define it, because in the end of the day, you're the designer of the impact campaign as well. So how do you then deal with that, and how you make a stand? And I think that's different, as we talked about a little bit before in our prep meeting, that there are different cultures. How far you dare to speak up for a subject or not, and how dangerous that might be journalistically and so on. But before we go to that, there's a question from Peter saying, can you talk about your relationship with the producers and or the directors? Do you define the goals of the impact campaign together? That's actually where we already talked about a little bit, and that's a very good point, I think, because they might be totally different, or not totally, that can never be, but different goals, especially what you were saying maybe with the distributors. But how is your experience then with the directors, producers, when you start to talk about your impact campaign, which can have different goals?
Yeah. So, like I said, I've come into projects, and I try to come into projects as early as possible. So often I am kind of working with a producer or a director. And I work on I work on very few kind of film projects. I pick and choose very, sort of selectively, because I go in deep, and it's not like you can't do an impact strategy and leave. It's like, so you're going to be in relationship with these people for a very long time. And I've been lucky to work with a couple of directors who themselves are very effective activists and advocates. So, I will work with, if I'm working with a director or a producer directly, it's because they're already also really good advocates. And that's the frame that they lead with. I don't tend to work with, there are directors and producers who don't want anything to do with the impact. Like, they will create the film and then they'll, I tend not to work with those. That's valid. It's fine. It's, it's not a judgment, but I tend not to work with people like that. So my
And
relationship.
the reason is you don't like to work with people like that without keep it totally anonymous, but you feel like then you together will not profit enough or get the best impact, or why would you not like if somebody would say like I made a documentary and you say that's a really good subject, I'll take it on and do the impact campaign. I say go for it. I'm not going to do Q&As or anything the like, only if it's about making of the film and it's fine. So what would be for you the reason not to pick up that film?
Because I think it, for me as an advocate, I need the entire team to sort of be moving in a certain direction.
Yeah.
And it does, for me, it affects the way a narrative is constructed. It affects the way a campaign is constructed, or sort of, like, I would never, so for example, I would never have been able to do 9 years of work on Who is Danny Cristal if I weren't in partnership with Mark Silver, the director, because we had common goals and we were able to check each other, and we were able to sort of like, when he was constructing the narrative, I knew what he was thinking, and I could sort of inject that into the way the narrative of the campaign, because otherwise it feels very disconnected, right?
And you have to maybe be each other counterparts and sometimes maybe slightly correct each other. I don't know, or
Also because, a campaign is not, when you're doing it based on cultural work, a campaign is not just a campaign, right? It's not just like, oh, we're going to send some tweets. It has its own story. It's a part of the narrative as well. And so you need to have a certain amount of flow between those two things. And again, that's me. That's my methodology. That's the way I like holistic, comprehensive systems kind of things. And so, and it's valid. Like there are filmmakers who will make a film, and then an impact, firm or whatever will take it on and they'll do the work. And again, that's totally valid. I'm not saying that, but that's not the way I work. So I will be in relationship with the creators.
But also to create, in the end of the day, the best impact, which personally, I think a filmmaker knows so much about their subject that it's very valid point to say, like, if they don't want to have to do anything with the impact campaign, that feels very, I can imagine that's very, very... Yeah.
But it's not always true. The filmmaker doesn't always know about their subject. And sometimes it's okay, because sometimes what you want is the pure story.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes you don't, sometimes there are filmmakers that you absolutely do not want anywhere near your impact, so that's
really, that happens as well. Okay. Yeah.
And I actually have worked with some people where you're just like, oh God, you need to stop talking now. Because they're
the talker.
Because like it becomes about them, right? All of a sudden they're like there, and this work has to be approached with a certain amount of humility, right? Like, we don't have all the answers. We're working with communities that are often traumatized, that are often not listened to, and they are being extracted from over and over again. And so I think we have to have a certain amount of humility, with the way. And so I like to work in direct relationship with like the creator of a project, who also has a certain amount of humility, who's saying like, this story must be told, is coming from a place of like, sort of generative, sort of cultural production. But
now, I was elaborating a little bit because I would always think, like, if you're filmmaking on a certain subject, you always want your film to have impact and as much as possible. Anyway, there's a question. It's about Writing with Fire from Janine. It's like, how do you find these inspirational people communities to make the film about? That's a question on filmmaking. For example, the film Writing with Fire is a film about such a specific story on this inspiring group of women. Do you find these stories, and after that, how do you approach these communities? But that's nearly more about the finding the stories, but it can go hand in hand. Let's put the question a little bit around in saying, like, do you sometimes see something happening in society and you think like that really should be made a film about, like, for instance, what's happened? I know that the filmmakers of Writing with Fire found this story actually through something in the news, and went to this rural area and found this main character, Mira, and structured the film about it. But can you be, as an impact producer or impact person, you're not only a producer, you do much more, be agenda setting in this?
I'm agenda setting, but I'm usually not. So, I'm a writer in my other, like in other places, so I will often write about topics myself. but I'm not a filmmaker, and I'm very determinedly not a filmmaker, because it is so consuming, right? So
Yeah, takes you years.
the question is, how do you find, if it's the questions to me, I don't find the stories, right? I very deliberately do not find the stories. I'm not bringing them to people. I had experimented with that a little bit, but it was so like there's a story, for example, that when I was in India last time, someone said, they're still burning women as witches, right? And this happens a lot in a lot of different places. And it was my cousin, who was a journalist himself, and he said, if you want to do anything, like tell the story, because it's like, and it's often they're not witches, they just happen to be single women or widows or whatever.
Yeah, just different. Yeah. It's always for another motivation.
So they're like, he was like, okay, tell this story. I'm like, okay, well, should I produce this story, and should I go down that line? And I started thinking about me as producer. And I was like, it is so consuming. I will give this story to somebody else, like if they want to do it, because it's not my role in the world. It's not my role in life. So I'm not the one who's finding
these kind of stories, like Writing with Fire stories, right?
Yeah, because what I need to do is I need to bring frameworks and structure and strategy and like the ability to catalyze actual change. And there are so many stories, and there's so many beautiful storytellers that I don't want to duplicate it. Like I am driven as an artist to write. I'm not driven as an artist to make films. That's just who I am. But how do the people who I work with find the stories? Well, for example, with Josh Fox, like when he was doing Gasland, it's because he became an activist in that he was an anti-war activist. He was an activist for a very long time and used theater as his medium before. He used to be a theater. And, someone, he owned some property in Pennsylvania, and a gas company came looking to see if they could purchase his property and like start fracking on the land. He was like, no. And he started thinking about it, and that story became his story, and it became the story of his community, and it became the story of the country. And that's how he found that story, and found like the little images that needed to sort of be part of the anti-fracking movement. So like that's how that story came about. With Who Is Danny Cristal, it's because Mark started embedding with the Pima County morgue in Arizona, and we have been talking about the violence of borders, right? So for 2 years he and I were working together and other things on creating like these like web assets and short stories around the violence inherent in borders and border security. And then he was at the morgue, and this body Dilse Johan's body came in, and that's where the story for Who Is Danny Cristal.
Yeah, then it's
Right? So it's like it's when it's in the ether, right? There's a set of issues, and we know what the issues we need to work on, right? Yeah. There are intersecting systemic issues that need to be worked on, and so
over and over again,
over and over again, right? And one of the mistakes I think the documentary community has made in the past is like, oh, well, we told that abortion rights story, or we told that migration story. No, we need multiple stories.
Well, we know about abortion, what's going on in the States now, so we need the stories. Like, I'm going to touch upon, because there's a question, and I want to make a little, see if I can lead this in a slightly different way, because we were talking about before, and why the Institute is film in Prague has wanted to do this webinar or lecture or a conversation, is that the States are a little bit ahead. We in the West are better. We're not there yet, but in Southeast Europe, to think about impact and to talk about impact, to use film as an impact tool, so to speak, is very in the beginning. And then we talked a little bit about before, like maybe it has to do with a cultural thing, because you have to speak out. You have to, even if it's this little bit, speak out politically. And that might be different in the different countries. And there's here a question which I find quite interesting. Taking upon that point, and I hope you go with my thoughts. It's asking, strategies can be so abused and are abused, used to service, not for the positive change. Do you have any examples we should be aware of that the goals are wrong or go wrong? So in other words, when you speak out, as I understand the question, but maybe you understand it different, as I interpret it, it is like, you can have impact goals, etc., but they can be misused and led to something completely different. Do you have experience with that? Do you have ideas on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So before I get to that, though, I wanted to, because Janine had 2 questions within this. I just wanted to answer the second question.
Yeah.
Which is, how do you find the stories? And after that, how do you approach these communities? So the finding the stories, like I said, is not deliberately, I make sure that's not my job, but how you approach these communities, that's my job, right? And so how you approach communities is, like I said, like, sort of with humility, but there has to be a relationship developed over time. And it's about taking a posture first of listening, right? It's very much about, there are old, decades old structures around participatory media and participatory sort of like storytelling. That's what I use. Those are sort of the frameworks that I use to make sure that when I go into a community, or when the team, like often it's not me, right, who's going in because I'm the strategist or something, but the way we construct is like, you're going to go in there with a listening posture, and this is how you're going to elicit information, and this is how you're going to you're just going to sit with people, and you're just going to sort of talk to people before you ever turn on a camera, before you ever jot down, they have to know you, they have to there has to be a certain amount of trust. And it's introductions, it's, sort of using the NGO community that may be trusted. It's working with community leaders like churches, libraries, community centers, whatever it is, but making sure that, I wrote a piece last year about the aid and development industry. And I tell the story now often. It's like I was in Tanzania, I was in Arusha, working with a nonprofit that wanted to sort of elevate child protection back into a national political agenda, and use transmedia storytelling in order to do that. And so before I even got to the organization, I did, sort of desk research, I did conversations and such, I did a lot of reading. And then for the first 2 days of the workshop, I asked them questions around the culture, around all these different things. And at a certain point, everybody sort of went quiet. And I thought I'd done something wrong, or people were getting tired. I'm like, oh, does anybody need a break? What was happening? And they one person just turned to me and they said, I'm sorry, nobody's ever done this before. No one's ever a designer or a strategist or someone has never come in and done all this fact finding and sort of perspective and perception building before telling us what the strategy, how we start doing the strategic planning. And I was like, that's interesting. That never occurred to me, that people weren't doing all this sort of information gathering first. Yeah. And I think that's really, so that's how I approach communities. That's how I approach people. And I try to do it through layers of other communities, right? So I'm not going straight to the person.
And let's watch the film and this is it.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what's your story now? Why are you assaulted? You're re-traumatizing people. So it's it has to be layers. And so that's why this work is hard. It takes time. It's often not compensated, which is a problem. All of this, fact finding, relationship building, cultivating community, inserting yourself into community. None of that stuff is it's rarely compensated, and that's a problem. That's another mistake that needs to change. Other question now. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I know. So thanks. It's good you said that what Shani was saying, because that's very true. And just really, and then we go back to the other question. And what we do is Movies That Matter. We give the filmmakers money for outreach in the region. So as we say, so what I don't know how much you could say that impact, but what we are very fanatic in, that people in the region where the film has been made can see the film. So in mobile cinema or whatever way, that the films go back to the communities where it's been shot, and that's always very important. And it's always, obviously, as you can see, we are from Human Rights Film Festival. It's always not sometimes the easiest film, but it's a very good way for people to see the film and then talk about it and so on. So that's one of the ways what we do at Movies That Matter. But we are a festival. We're obviously not an impact campaigning group. And then to pick up on the last question, what's been asked is not the last question of today, but I mean in the chat. about abuse and abuse of your impact strategy and your impact plan, and that can sometimes make people more reluctant to step out in the light to say, this is the campaign, this is what we were campaigning for, or something like the impact campaign. Could you elaborate on that, or what's your experience? Yeah,
sure. So there are a couple of different ways, to answer this question. The first one is just in terms of like strategy in general. That it's I'm a lefty, right? I'm a progressive in the United States. I'm a progressive. I'm sort of a lefty politically, and I remember I was putting together a framework. We developed a framework with the Rockefeller Foundation called Transformational Change Leadership. That's freely available to anybody who wants it. It's a Creative Commons license thing. Anybody can use this framework. So it's at tcleadership.org, and it really it takes you through how we can all catalyze transformational change in our communities or in our societies. And one of the things that we discussed for a long time with my advisory committee was, how do you? One advisor was like, how do you prevent this from getting into the hands of like the right wing or sort of authoritarians or whatever? And I'm like, I can't prevent that. And the way I've constructed the framework and the narrative around the framework is about progress and positive progress for the most marginalized, right? So people who are, either women or non-binary folks or, people of color or, marginalized communities around the world. And so there's language in there that I've like, it's not just signals encoded. Like I've said, this is for positive progress, for prosperity for all. And so, sort of that kind of a framework. But can I prevent someone from taking it and saying, well, how do we, sort of like reduce rights using this framework? I can't prevent people from doing that. It's probably less successful, I would think, because it is, constructed in a way that is about positive progress. So that's in terms of like strategy. You have to be really clear about who the strategy is for, like how you sort of create the language and the narrative around it, how you tell the story of the work that you're doing. On the other hand, sort of particular strategies for films. Anybody somebody who's an opponent of what you want to do with a particular strategy or a particular campaign can weaponize it against you or can weaponize it against the community. That's happened, right? Where, I've seen this happen, especially in the migration space, where you're like, you are trying very hard to make a moral case and very hard to make a human case. And people come at you either with a business case or they come at you with like, they will. One of the things that we had that the team had produced and Who Is Danny Cristal was a New York Times op doc called Bodies on the Border, and that was part of our strategy for pushing out other content and seeding dialogue around border death. And people use that against in the right wing. The commentary was really bad and it was sort of shown in different circles. So yes, often you can't necessarily prevent that. You just have to saturate. You have to be loud and clear and moral and ethical, and you have to shape the narrative of your strategy in a way that leaves no question about where you stand, right, or where the campaign stands or where the community stands. But you can't prevent people from necessarily abusing it. You have to be prepared to fight that, right? And then the third way to answer this question is that there are people who are quote unquote on our side, right? Who maybe think they're for progress, but really are for their own profit. And so, that's an abuse. It's not me on the left versus them on the right. It's not, sort of like people,
but it's misused in a certain way.
It's like the way they abuse strategy in the first place, right? And so there's I won't name names because we shouldn't do that. But
no, I prefer to keep it anonymous.
Keep it anonymous and keep it positive. But I remember there's this one. I was invited to a private screening of one documentary where it was supposedly about positive change on one issue, and the way the community was portrayed in the film was incredibly racist. And when I tried to point that out, people were like, well, this is about this issue, so we're not going to care about this. And so there are many ways to abuse a strategy. And I think, often my anger or when I see that kind of abuse goes to the people who are purportedly on quote unquote our side, who are trying to make positive change, but keep harming other people when they do it. So
that's it. And if I can pick up on that, but maybe slightly different angle, the other two projects were like this. This is like when one full documentary, but the other one, when you have podcasts, you have series, you have maybe social media and so on. How do you deal with that? Because on the one hand, if I imagine it's like that's fantastic tool for impact, because you can reach so many people, but by reaching so many people, it can be misused, it can be used for other things and so on. So how was it for you, the second project you were talking about, or the showcase, the study case you gave us? I mean, that there was many different things going on. How you then shaped your impact campaign?
I mean, so, again, it's like mostly Josh Fox is doing, quite a lot of this work. And he gets a lot of abuse. He gets a lot of online abuse.
Right. Yeah.
He has to deal with all the time. And you can't, if you're going to be vocal, if you're going to take a stand, if you're going to take a political or a cultural stand, inevitably somebody's going to say something to you.
Yeah.
That is,
you have to be prepared for that. Yeah.
You have to be prepared for it. You have to have, structures of support around you. This is another mistake that I think, was made by some of the Western documentary folks, where, especially around, the Black Lives Matter protests and stuff, impact strategists, filmmakers, activists were being threatened.
Yeah.
And there wasn't necessarily there wasn't a proactive understanding of the need for systems of support, emotional support, psychological support, but also like just plain old security, things like that. And so like that is an absolute necessity, to a certain extent, because if you're on social media, if you're vocal, someone's going to come after you. It's just going to happen. And you have to be prepared for it. You have to have structures of support around it. You have to have, sort of privacy and security concerns. Having said that, it's often the best way to sort of fight this at the beginning is to have your own structures of support, but also to be really clear about your own narrative.
Yeah. And your message, I guess, your narrative, but also the message you want to come across. Sorry?
There's the narrative, there's the message, and then there's the action, right? Because this is the way I construct these strategies it is about the narrative, and it's about perception and narrative shift, but it's really about driving people to very particular actions. And sometimes those are, there's a huge, especially in the United States, people like to see legislative action, like, did you move a policy forward or something? I mean, that's one way to do it. Absolutely, it's very crucial. But often, screening things for Congress in the United States has been some of the most depressing professional work I've ever done. But I think it's really important to have community-led action. Like, where are people, and it can be small, like where are people, can you do a social media campaign that everybody joins and sort of creates a saturation around a particular message? Is it donating to someone? Like I said, one of the things that we did with Is Danny Cristal is raise money for the community, ask them what will prevent children, because children as young as 5 and 6 were leaving the community and making the journey into Mexico and above the U.S. Customs Force. Like, what will help you, not have your children leave? And we have no water, we have no, so the school is from, things like that. And so, raising money for that, like, there are different ways you can think about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And there's a moral clarity to that. It's really hard, I think, to assault or assail someone who is trying to create community-led positive change if you yourself can stand in the moral clarity of what you are trying to do.
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to, like, there's a strain of documentarians who don't believe that they should be doing that work. And I dispute that, especially as an advocate and especially as the impact strategist. I'm like, you don't have to do it. let us do it.
But you're associated with it, and maybe that's why some people are still slightly, maybe in Eastern Europe, I don't know, could be slightly reluctant, because you have to speak out in a political way, and the one regime is not so open-minded or democratic or whatever you want to call it than the other, and then it can bring you in a more dangerous position, as we have seen. Yeah. I mean, I know filmmakers who made a documentary, fantastic film, of the Hungarian opposition leader, and they absolutely, I won't say to which country, I won't say who they are, but after that film they absolutely had to leave the country. There was no way they could stay, and I think an impact campaign then at that time in Hungary would have been a really difficult one. So sometimes it's slightly it is slightly impossible, I suppose.
And that's why, like, I mean, it is very important to be careful and to have security and to have all those different things. It's also important to be smart. Like, you have to think when you're going to take a risk. Like, there was very little risk for me, for example, to work on something like Is Danny Cristal, because first of all, I'm an American citizen. I'm not from that same community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are, many different ways of taking risk. I think that in a regime, anywhere from like Brazil to the Philippines to Hungary to India, whatever, people have to be really smart.
What's very smart? There's an amazing case. I don't know if you know the film Softy, about the Kenyan opposition leader, which went to Sundance and so on. And what happened there was that the film was embraced, like actually Writing with Fire, all over the world. I mean, I spoke to them in Berlin, and 2 weeks later they were going to have their big premiere in Kenya, and they were very nervous about it. I said, okay, I'll ring the ambassador of the Netherlands to be there, and a lot of other to be there. And actually there was a positive cordon sanitaire of politician and international community that nothing happened, and we were one of the ones to help them to travel the film all over Kenya. Yeah. And that really worked. So what was a impact strategy in this case is like get the film, and it was an extremely good story, good story, extremely well told, a fantastic film, and it traveled the world, and that made the international political awareness that big that within Kenya, I mean, they could not, I mean, that was their protection in a way, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah, of course you understand what I'm saying.
International solidarity on these things.
Yeah, that's what the word, international solidarity, that's what it's about.
But also sometimes not every film needs an impact campaign. Like, I think obviously I'm an impact.
That's actually quite a good remark. Yeah, there's still another question, and we nearly at the end, but that's a very good, that's true. Yeah, some people, sorry?
Not every film needs it, right? No. Not every film, like I am an impact strategist, so I think very deeply about like strategy. Not everything needs it. Number two, not everything needs to be made by a person from the most affected community. It needs to be respectful of, like, and again, as someone who is deeply, deeply community focused, like, I think that the closer you can get to the community, and if somebody's from the affected community themselves, that's the best. But sometimes, particularly in terms of like being silenced or being threatened or being just unable, physically or politically unable to do a story, sometimes it's okay for someone outside the community to do it.
Absolutely, I think so as well.
Because there are different protections, and also there are other ways to tell stories. Like, again, it doesn't have to be necessarily, like Writing with Fire is actually, I mean, it's political, but it's not. It's also just a human story.
Absolutely.
And people from the right wing are watching it saying, this is kind of, these women are cool, Yeah.
And their leader or their man was in the film. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I think there are different ways to do this. You have to be really strategic. You have to be really smart. You have to be super careful, because what you don't want to do is encourage necessarily, you don't want to be silenced, but you also don't want to encourage more silence, if that makes any sense.
It makes very much sense.
Fragile time right now, right? We're in a very fragile time internationally. And so we need to sort of work in partnership across borders to be able to.
Well, I think that's one of a very important thing you were just saying. This I didn't think about it, but this international solidarity around certain and with the whole community as we internationally are, and due to the pandemic, we speak to each other far more than we've ever did so quickly. We should be doing that. Before we go, there's another question. Maybe there's even more now after these last few minutes. It's somebody's asking, there are many impact toolkits available, which is true, from organizations. And then the key question, which one would you recommend to use if I want to learn the basics more about the different campaigns?
So, I mean, the plug that I'll make is for the one, I don't know if it was circulated, but I wrote a piece, I worked with an organization called Engage Media, which
Engage Media. Okay, people write that down. Engage Media, yeah.
And they are sort of an organization that works in coalition with a number of different NGOs and Video for Change, the Video for Change community. And they're based in Jakarta. They're run by a man named Andrew Lowenthal, who is Australian. So it's sort of an international organization. And I helped them write the Video for Change Impact Toolkit.
Video for Change Impact Toolkit, yeah.
So that's freely available. I think it's videoforchangetoolkit.org or something. So I'll
Google it. We will Google it. Jakarta.
Yeah. So it's the Video for Change Impact Toolkit from Engage Media. And it's sort of this comprehensive toolkit that takes you from story conception and starts you on strategy and evaluation at the beginning, right? And takes you through the stages of production into community engagement with the basis of ethics, right? So it's all based on sort of documentary ethics, community sort of engagement ethics, community facing, community forward, community led. So I would suggest that one. Then I would also, I think in terms of there are case studies in there. It's more heavily weighted to Asia and Southeast Asia and sort of like the global South. So that's that's one of the reasons I love that toolkit as well. Then there is the Doc Society Impact Toolkit, which is which is full of sort of case studies, and that's sort of based on larger documentaries, right? So Video for Change is based. It's smaller. It's more comprehensive. It's also smaller films, bigger films. It's global South creators. Doc Society is sort of more the larger, sort of more festival running documentaries. So I think between those two, you will get a really good sense of case studies and possibilities, and and the way to sort of think about things in terms of impact strategy.
Yeah. Okay. So if for wrapping it up, and if we for the people listening today, what would be your advice if you now feel like I'm a filmmaker and I'm making a film, but I'm actually in a political, slightly uncertain area, and how do I deal then with all the pressures and all the things? Who should we talked about it a lot, but just to sort of wrap it up. So I need to think carefully about my producer, distributor, impact person, and the impact person, as I wrote note down, but I know who has to have a really strong network and know where they are going, right, and for which group you are doing it. And also apart from that, the other track is about balancing out the risks when you do an impact campaign. And what else would you advise?
Yeah. So if you are a filmmaker who, number one, wants to work with an impact producer, or again, figure out whether you want to, right? I think that impact strategy is absolutely crucial to move the needle forward on issues collectively, and also so how you can contribute. Not everything needs it, but if you want it, it's there, and you should really think about it. Number two, if you are making a film in a sort of politically sensitive area, whether it's in terms of issue or in terms of region, make sure that you're in community with people around the world who are doing this work. So, check out the Global Impact Producers group that's being run by Doc Society. Talk to, people who are on this webinar, like Media That Matters and such. Make sure that you're in community with people. as much as possible. I know it's really hard to travel now, but like, at any
well, we can travel digital, right?
Travel digitally. So, make sure you're like contributing,
Yeah.
asking questions, sort of like, joining these groups that are around like sort of, the round tables at IDFA or CPH Docs or Hot Docs next year.
We're launching now an impact in this, like Geneva does it, and we have Take on Film and Impact for 2 days, which you can attend the webinars and so on as well, and talk.
So attend those, because you want to be known, you want to be seen, but also you want to like get advice and create relationships with people. Make sure that, like I said, the Global Impact Producers Group is good because there's a set of people who do this work.
Yeah, sure.
I think that's really important. And then think about how you can always sort of think about how you can protect yourself as a storyteller, in terms of the purity of your story, because people will try to get you to alter it. If it's an advocacy piece, stick to your guns on that. Make sure you're never extractive though. Like don't extract from the community. Don't do poverty porn. Don't do any of that stuff. But, sort of stick with the majesty of the story. But also, make sure that you are always talking to the NGO community, the advocates in your area, and figuring out how you can protect yourself as a storyteller from outside forces. It's community. The community is the answer. That's what's the answer.
That's where the answer, and what do they need? Because that's where impact is about as well. Like, you make an intro, but with which goal? It's for community. It might be for influencers. It might be for politicians, for change makers, for all of that. And you have to map that out as well. I reckon that's something you do.
That's the impact side. The filmmaker doesn't need to do that.
That's what you are doing. That's what you're doing. Dear Lina, I think I could talk to you for hours and here listen to you, because I think it's highly important work. And I personally am a total believer in that film image, engaged by film, can make, then when you show that to people, whoever in society, can really change people and make people reconciliate, make people understand the other, etc., etc. So I can preach on that quite a lot. I will not do that. I will not do so, because we talked already for 1.5 hours, which was fantastic. Yeah, that's how fast it goes when there's an interesting conversation going on, I suppose. And thank you so much. And for everybody, tomorrow at 6:00, you're back. Am I right?
I am. I believe so. Yeah, there's a webinar.
There will be.
Hannah can tell everybody about that.
And Hannah will tell that to everybody. Thank you so much for now. Thank you, Lina. Thank you.
So much.